Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
And we are back with another SpyMaster interview, perhaps one of the biggest we've ever had. Cam, who do we have joining us this week?
Yes, we are being joined by the Living Daylights star Maryam, who played Kara in that very memorable James Bond film, the first for Timothy Dalton.
Yeah, I mean, at time of recording, both of the Dalton films have just screened in UK cinemas. People are talking all about these films. The love is growing for the Dalton era. So I couldn't think of a more perfect time to share our interview with you than, as part of this resurgence of Dalton love and also part of our celebration for our 100th episode. So I think, Cam, without further ado, roll the interview. And joining us now, it is Maryam Darbo. Hello, Maryam.
Hello, how are you?
Doing great. We're really excited to have you on the show.
Nice to
We're
meet
both
you
big
all.
fans of Living Daylights.
Thank you. It's like you saw it before you were born.
I was born. I would have been about 7 when it came out. So
Yeah, okay. Yeah, 1987 when it came out. That's right.
yeah.
Yeah. So, God, such a long time ago.
Well, I think we'll just get straight down to how you got started. I wonder how you got started in acting necessarily before we get to the Bond part, and maybe what led to Bond. So what were some of your first roles you had and what led you to Bond?
I started acting in 1981. I'm bilingual because I grew up all my life in France. So I did theatre in France. I did 2 plays and 1 TV movie in France. One of the plays you will know because it's been played all over the world. It's Cyrano de Bergerac playing Roxanne.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a French TV movie there and then another play. And then I was involved in doing mini-series in England in the 80s. Lots of mini-series that were being done and that were being shot at Pinewood Studios when it wasn't on location. One of them was about the OSS organization, which was a lot of American TV series and mini-series that were American that were coming to London at the time. So a lot of British actors were working in those mini-series. And the Bond movie happened in 1986. I had seen John Glenn for one of the Roger Moore ones, which was Fiona Fullerton, who played the girl who's in the bathtub. And I didn't even audition. I think I just saw John for the part, but it just didn't feel quite right. And then in 1986, cut to when Roger Moore's finished, a few years later, not doing it anymore, they were looking for a new Bond, and I did a screen test at Pinewood Studios in the spring of 1986 to do the lines for one of the actors who was auditioning for Bond, and the whole crew were there at Pinewood. Cubby Broccoli, John Glenn was back directing the new Bond films with a new actor. And I just did a screen test from Russia with Love with this actor who was up for Bond. And that was it. And it was a very nice day. And I was paid for the day doing the screen test. And I went off to Germany to start a movie from a Nabokov novel called After in the Dark. And I was playing with Maximilian Schell. Mick Jagger at that point was attached. We did about 3 weeks shooting in Munich, and then the film, it was in June of 1986, and the film collapsed. There was a problem with the money rolling in. And the director who was directing this feature film, Laughter in the Dark, edited the 3 weeks that we'd done and like a little 20-minute short and sent it to studios in America. And one of the studios was United Artists. And they were casting their actress for the next Bond movie, which was a Czechoslovakian character, a cellist, Kara Milovy. And they hadn't found her. And I came back to London a little bit out of sorts because the film had collapsed and it was a bit strange and nobody got paid and all of that. And I bumped into Barbara Broccoli at a health club, And she did a double take, but because she didn't recognize me, because I looked very different. I had my hair cut like a bob, because it was set in 1930s Berlin, Laughter in the Dark, Nabokov's novel. So I looked very different. I'd lost a lot of baby fat. I just looked much more Slavic. And she mentioned it to Kavi Broccoli and John Glenn, and they decided to bring me in at Pioneer Studios to have an interview with them. And at the same time, United Artists just called them up because they were doing Bond at the time. It's not MGM or Sony. United Artists said, we've seen this girl in this film, Laughter in the Dark. And she could very much be right for the role in Bond, in The Living Daylights. So I was brought in, met with Kavi Broccoli, John Glenn. It was a very charming interview, and little did I know, I think a week later, I got the part. My agent called me up and told me that I'd gotten the role in the new James Bond with Pierce Brosnan at the time. And Pierce was finishing this TV series he'd done, but he got so much publicity for being the next new Bond that his contract got renewed on the TV series in America. And so they approached Timothy Dalton, and Timothy said yes. They already had approached him a while back, and he had said no, but this time he said yes, because they wanted to go back to a more classic Bond, much more following Ian Fleming's novels. And that was it. And in September, we started shooting, or was it end of September? And I did a lot of rehearsals, learning how to mime the pieces I had to do on the cello, because I was playing a cellist. And so I had to mime all the pieces of Dvorak that I was going to be pretending to play. And they put dry soap on the bow, so it takes off the sound. But I learned the movements. So I did 4 weeks of classes of private coaching with this lovely cellist teacher. And then I was also, learning how to horseback ride, because I had a couple of scenes on a horse in the film. And we started shooting, I think, mid-September. And we started shooting in Vienna the first 2 weeks. And Vienna was representing Bratislava, which is where I came from. Mm-hmm. My character came from, Kara Milovy. So, and then from Vienna, we went on to Morocco, where we shot for 6 weeks, 7 weeks. We were in Tangier and then in the desert in Ouarzazate. And then we came back, we had Christmas break. And then we were shooting at Pioneer Studios. No, we went for a week in Weissensee in the Austrian mountains to do all the sequence on the cello case sliding down the mountain, which everybody who's seen the movie, remembers. And and then we were shooting at Pioneer Studios, all the interiors. And we finished, I think, end of February, because it was 5 months shooting the entire film. And the film premiered in London, I think, at the beginning of June. We had a royal premiere with Princess Diana and Prince Charles in the Odeon, Leicester Square. And from there on, I went touring around the world, doing publicity, and then for all the different premieres around the world. So yes, it was quite a journey.
I actually watched the Leicester Square royal premiere this morning on YouTube. Actually, they really went all out for it. Actually, yeah, it was quite the spectacle.
It is a spectacle, and it was a very hot evening. It was a heat wave going on in London, which is rare, as we know.
Mm-hmm, very much.
And I was wearing a beautiful designer's dress, Emanuele Ungaro. But it was a very tight dress. It was like a sort of like a mermaid dress, very tight. And I was going to the premiere with Timothy Dalton, and I used to have a little house in Fulham in a very small street. So he came into one of the big cars to pick me up that they had organized to pick up Timothy, and then picked up me. And he got stuck in terrible traffic, which there always is in Fulham in those small streets. And so we arrived running late. And when we arrived in Charing Cross Road, they wouldn't let us in with the car to drive in front of the Odeon Leicester Square. The policemen there, the bobbies, were saying, "No, I'm afraid it's too late. You can't come through. The royal family is coming. It's shut." Da, da, da. And Timothy was saying, "But excuse me, but we are the actors in the film." And they said, "Yeah, I've heard that before." And he said, "No, actually, I'm playing James Bond." And said, "Yeah, and you're maybe George Lazenby." And so Timothy just thought, okay, we're not getting anywhere there. So we went out, and he grabbed me by the hand, and we maneuvered through the crowds. And I was in this dress that was so tight, walking like a little Chinese woman, with little steps, because I could barely sort of do big steps in this heat. And we arrived in front of the front doors of the Odeon Leicester Square Cinema. And suddenly the crowds parted, and they knew that it was us, because obviously we were unknown, right? And then we had the whole arrival of the royal family, and you're lined up and you have to say hello and all of that. And I had to go quickly to the loo, and I had a problem with the dress, because I had, obviously with the heat, I'd swollen up and I couldn't put the dress back down. So I was running late, but I made it up there. But it was quite funny, I have to say. It was very comedic. And I was up there in the lineup, breathless, and recomposed myself for when Princess Diana and Charles came and greeted us, all lined up, the lead actors, the producers, the director, and we had the screening, and I was sitting next to Prince Charles in the screening of our premiere, and he kept asking me all these questions about the stunts, which I obviously did very few stunts, only in my scenes, a couple of stunts, but all the other stunts I couldn't answer for, because I wasn't in the scenes. So I was always a bit speechless, saying, I don't know, because he loved it. He loved seeing all those stunts, and all the action going on.
They famously visited the set for the film, and I think wasn't it Princess Diana who whacked him over the head with the sugar bottle?
Exactly, it was a sugar bottle of champagne, because they had a prop room right next door, where they did all of these, fun little props, Diana, basically whacked the sugar bottle on Prince Charles' head. We had stopped shooting for a couple of hours while they were visiting, but we were still in the middle of shooting at Pinewood.
I had a question about Barbara Broccoli. This is her first film as an associate producer. She would go on to become a producer. And when I look at the character of Kara, she's much more grounded than, the Bond female leads of the last handful of films. Was there any influence coming from Barbara in this producer role to help shape this character?
You mean to make the female characters more real?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? And less sort of cartoon-like. Well, I did a documentary for AMC cable network in America called the Bond Girls Are Forever, and that's the whole story, is the evolution of Bond girls from Ursula Andress to Halle Berry. When I did this documentary film with John Watkins, who was a director, and I was producing it and co-directing it with him, and basically. The producers always, every time they would deliver a script, they would always try to mirror a little bit what was going on in society, because you always have to keep up to date with how the world is going and turning around, the relationship between Bond and the Bond girls, and how the roles evolved over time, and that was my story, because Judi Dench became James Bond's boss. So she, she had all the power, because he had to follow, her directions. They definitely always were trying to make the girl more real. You have the 60s, which was, the Bond girls were like these action girls, but there wasn't much in the character psychologically in the relationship with Bond. They were always very exotic and very beautiful. you had some of the Bond girls who had superpowers. You think of Pussy Galore, Honor Blackman. She had a whole team, and she was an incredible judo fighter and all of that. And the relationship between Bond and those Bond girls, either being villainess, was always kind of very tongue in cheek. And then it got more edgy and more realistic, and I think it started changing for me. Well, after Octopussy with Maud Adams, where she had a big role. She had the lead, and she appeared twice in 2 Bond movies. The Man with the Golden Gun, where she was the girlfriend of Christopher Lee, and she was very much victimized and a victim, and the girls were always seen a bit like victims. And all of that change in the writing of the roles. I would say I was just the beginning of it, the 80s, where my role had a bit more sensitivity. There was more of a relationship with James Bond. She was a musician, so she was not some girl who had superpowers. She didn't know how to shoot a gun properly or anything like that. So there was a bit more of a realistic character. And then I think with Michelle Yeoh, it started changing a lot, for me anyway. And I thought she was fantastic as a Bond girl, and in fact, she's a much better fighter than James Bond was, Pierce Brosnan, in the role. But that's because they cast her because she was an expert at that. She was a big star in Asia, as you know, for all those was it kung fu fighting or whatever. She was a martial arts extraordinary character, and a very good actress. So they started evolving with Michelle Yeoh. That was the 90s, and then you had Halle Berry, who came along and who was much more challenging with Bond. So it did start before these ones with Daniel Craig. The Casino Royale, as you know, it's doing a remake of Casino Royale, and that was from Ian Fleming's books. Then they started, inventing the scripts, and there has been an evolution, and certainly in the last 2 with Daniel Craig, because he has a proper relationship with this girl, and she reappears in the second one, in the last sort of swan song for Daniel Craig, I think that's great. I think it's important that there's this evolution, constant evolution, and mirroring society. I do miss certain characters. I loved Judi Dench playing M.
Mm-hmm.
I thought because it was also mirroring what was happening in MI5. Stella Remington, who became head of MI5 in London, and there was a lot of spunk to the dialogue, and her relationship with Bond, very witty, and certainly real competition going on, and I liked that sort of personally, that sort of energy that was going on between, like the way Bond used to flirt with Miss Moneypenny, and I felt in this new Bond film, which much more of an edgy, serious Bond film, but an homage to a lot of the old Bond movies. I thought Daniel Craig's role was much fuller, and that's not only Barbara. Of course, Barbara has a huge influence on making the women's roles stronger, but it's also Daniel Craig, who I think came along more and more as a collaborator. As his character was evolving. He did what, 3-4 Bonds? So, and in his last one, obviously, this big relationship he has with this woman who's a daughter of a scientist, and Emmanuel, Léa Seydoux is great. I think I missed a bit more humor, maybe, in their relationship, maybe. But it's a generational thing. Every time I meet somebody who's seen a Bond movie, if they're in their 60s, they say, oh, I loved, Sean Connery. If they're in their 50s or 40s, they'll say, oh, I loved Pierce Brosnan, or Roger Moore, So it's really a generational thing. I think there is no right or wrong. And what's marvelous is that, you have this series where you do have the choice.
Well, you mentioned Michelle Yeoh before, and I'm not sure you give yourself credit enough there, because I think the change really started with you in terms of the more progressive female characters.
I think my character was more human. Yeah, more human, definitely.
Yeah.
It was just very naive, because you know anything about the world of spies and secret agents and all of that. So she was extremely innocent in that way. She was a musician, She didn't have any. She was not the daughter of a scientist, or what I mean. So she had none of that narrative with her. So she was extremely naive, and she fell in love with Bond. So
who wouldn't?
He was not only exactly handsome and all of that, but he brought her to the West for her to have a career.
What
as a
was
musician? So that was an important factor.
If we're looking at the character then of Kara, what was the difference between what you were initially pitched towards what actually ended up on the screen? What did you help develop that character into? Because I think, from what I've read, you played a strong part in this. And of course, you then went on to do the documentary as well. So you clearly care about this aspect of the Bond world. So how did you help craft that character, and how did it change?
No, well, I never changed the script. There was no improv or anything like that. The script was as is. And what you see on the screen is the script. So that was never altered in any way. So I sort of just tried to make it my own. Of course, I had a wonderful this wonderful dialect coach in Washington, who was helping me do this sort of Czechoslovakian accent that was audible, understandable for the American market, as opposed to a very strong Czech accent. But I just kept thinking, I've got to make her human. I've got to make her real and in the moment. So that's really what I worked on, making her as human as possible, and responding. How would this character respond in crazy situations of car chases, being shot at and all of that. So that's background work for an actor. So but I just made her as human and as what's the word, very alive,
Yeah, it's really notable to me how there's like a very sincere romance to this movie. It's like quite like poignant and touching at points. And I would just love to know about working with Dalton to make this relationship really work in a massive scale movie surrounded by, all the action, all the locations, all that sort of stuff.
Well, Timothy Dalton, is a real pro. Number one, he's done a lot of theatre. He was in a lot of, classic TV films that were made, in his day, and he did theatre. So he was a very generous man to work with, very generous actor, and I have to say he was a huge support, because it was intimidating at the beginning, filming on with such a big machine, and we certainly there was I think a good chemistry going on screen between us, and I can only say good things about working with Timothy. He really is a pro, and did everything to help me when I was a little bit, at a loss in certain scenes, to make the scene good and work, So I'm very, very happy that I did it with Timothy. He was my Bond, I guess, So, and all of those scenes, you're talking about the romantic scenes, we tried to make them as real and as human as possible, about two people, who find themselves in a completely mad situation, but there's this chemistry, and she falls for him, and he knows he's James Bond and he can't get attached to anybody, yet he's moved by her. And I think, Timothy, having the background as an actor that he has, brought his sensitivity to the role when it was needed in our scenes, and he was absolutely great. I mean, I really, really take my hat off for Timothy, who was not. I think Timothy had really fun playing Bond, because it was a challenge for him. But I think what he did not have fun was the aftermath after the filming was finished, was doing all the press. That was not really his thing, and he's quite low key. It was not his thing being propelled as a sex symbol and a sort of sex star and doing all this press around the world. That was not really his thing. But working together was very special and will always be a lovely memory. And it was a very happy filming or shoot for all of us. The crew became a big family because we were on charter planes all together, flying to Morocco, then flying to Austria, or when we went to Vienna. So we got to know each other all very well, and there was a real trust, which is also thanks to Cubby Broccoli, who was a wonderful producer, and he certainly produced the film that I did. I think I can say this was the last film that he properly produced, because then on the one in Mexico that he did with Timothy, he was ill, and started being ill, and it was much harder for them to shoot in Mexico City with the pollution, with the studios, the communication, the Spanish, and all of that. I think it was much more challenging for them. And on our film, of course, it's always a challenge for them making a Bond film. It's not easy. Don't think it's all glamorous and fun. It's a lot of hard work. You can imagine all the obstacles for the producers, when we were doing all the shooting in Morocco, bringing in all these guns, by plane and all of that. You can imagine the paperwork, the this, the that, so it was complicated, but it was a very happy film set, really was. And John Glenn, very easygoing as a director, very experienced because he'd done quite a fefew Bond movies with Roger Moore. He before had worked as an assistant editor with David Lean, and he understood how to cut a movie. So when he was doing all the action sequences, he knew exactly where he was going to cut. So, there was a real professionalism and a real, it was really rolling. It was great. And we also had a lot of fun, in the evenings when you're stuck in the desert, and there were a lot of fun moments with all of us. And Tangier was fabulous. But it was complicated for the producers because we were shooting in Morocco, and you can imagine all the stuff they had to deal with, to shoot there and get permission and this and that. But on the whole, anybody you can ask who was on The Living Daylights, they had a really good time.
We spoke with John Glenn recently. Actually, he did mention working with you, and it's kind of the reason why I actually originally got in contact to speak to you. It's kind of how I worked my way here. But speaking of what you just said as well, and he spoke quite highly of the set and enjoying the production of Living Daylights. Is there any stories that stick out to you of just from making the film, any particular moments that you think back on fondly?
Well, I do remember. I remember, because I had to learn how to horseback ride, and I had this beautiful white Arabic horse. And I remember the poor horses were all coughing a lot. There was this coughing virus going around amongst the horses. Anyway, these gorgeous Arabic horses, and mine was white with a long crane, just gorgeous. And for us to sort of get, a hang with those horses and get to know them, we went once or twice riding in the desert with the stuntmen. I was the only girl, so I loved it. I was like Lawrence of Arabia. There I was with all the stuntmen, Art Malik, Timothy Dalton, it was just fantastic. And we'd go galloping in the desert, and I absolutely loved it. It was just such a moment of joy and beauty, because we came back at sunset, and the sunsets and the dawns in Morocco in the desert were just mind blowing. So we had to get up at 5 in the morning, sometimes 4:30, because daylight was very early. 4:30 in the morning to go into the makeup bus. But it was absolutely stunning. And I do remember the crew were complaining about Moroccan food when we were in the desert. You didn't have much choice. You were not in a hotel, I mean, there was a hotel, but it was very limited. And I think the crew were getting a bit of a stomach problems, all of them. And so Cubby Broccoli had flown over from Italy some pasta, and Barbara Broccoli took over the kitchens with a couple of others who helped her to make pasta for the whole crew one evening, and that was a lot of fun. It's great. You can imagine how they were so happy to have, as far as they're concerned, normal food. So there was a real camaraderie and a real. It was really nice, very, very nice.
I would love to know if you've noticed a difference in how Living Daylights is received then versus now.
Well, first of all, it's slightly politically incorrect because at the time the Russians occupied Afghanistan, and the Mujahideens, who were not necessarily all Talibans, but some were at the time, were being glorified because they were helping the West, right, under the Russian occupation. So that's kind of changed today radically. So if you watch The Living Daylights, I'm like, oh my God, especially that now today everything has to be politically correct, whatever you say and all of that. People are very sensitive. But when I watched it, there was after 37 years, how many years has it been now since 1987? 37 years.
34, because I was born that year.
So after 27 years, you were born that year, right?
Sorry.
After 27 years, Pinewood organized a special screening with cast and crew and a meal and everything. So I haven't seen it, obviously, until after 27 years. And I have to say, I was watching it with all this hindsight and laughing my head off. I just thought my character was actually at times a bit silly with some of my naive questions. It was quite funny, and I enjoyed the bantering that went on with Timothy, And when I would say to Timothy when we were out of the prison cell, when we got out of the prison cell in which is supposed to be Afghanistan, I say, we're free, and he looks at me and says, Kara, we're in the middle of a Russian, base, we're not free. So there were some really funny. Yeah, I mean, I laughed a lot, I have to say. I really did. It made me laugh a lot. I thought there was a lot of funny things in it. And I absolutely loved the music that John Barry did to our film. In fact, I think it was the best Bond music that he did, John Barry. And my favorite of all the Bond films, I think it was, because it was jazzed up, but it still had the Bond theme. And then I loved Chrissie Hynde's love song that she wrote the lyrics, but John Barry was inspired by our love scenes, and so he wrote composed this music for our love scenes. And so I loved that song that Chrissie Hynde sings. If there was a man, I can't sing, but I really did. And so I was transported by the music. I thought all the stuff in the fun fair in Vienna was hilarious, and obviously sort of an homage to The Third Man in bits. And I loved seeing the villains, and Yoram Krabi and Jodon Baker and Art Malik playing the very, very handsome Mujahideen. And I actually, I really liked Timothy in it. I thought he had he'd found an integrity in Bond. He brought a different Bond. Every actor that's played James Bond has brought their own, into the character. And I know he was criticized a lot by people who wanted more humor, but now when you look at it, it's full of humor compared to the ones today, I find that now it's so witty. But in those days, when the film came out, it was not as witty as under Roger Moore. Obviously because Roger Moore, played so much on his brilliant wit that he had.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a good time watching it. I had a good time, and obviously, as an actor, you're always thinking, "Oh my god, I could redo this scene,"
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned going back and watching it again. I want to touch on the Bond Girls Are Forever documentary in a second, but I did have one final Living Daylights question, and that is, obviously, you revisited it on the 27th anniversary. Looking back on it now, what are you most proud of about the film?
You mean as far as scenes, or as the film in itself?
Whatever springs to mind for you, what are you most proud of about it?
I'm proud because it's definitely takes you. You definitely travel in these great locations. I think I'm really proud of. I really, really loved the music in the film. Loved it. I did the intro, but I really responded to the music in the film, and I still get goosebumps when I hear it. I'm proud to have worked with Timothy Dalton because I personally liked the bond that he brought to the screen, and I do like our one or two love scenes together, and I think they're charming. And I'm proud of them. The fantasy it still has, it's not a dull Bond, you know what I mean? It's not, you don't have a dull moment, and it moves, and I think that's also thanks to John Glenn, the way he sort of put it together. He knows about how to make these scenes move along, and then have some scenes in repose. So I loved thought the costumes were fabulous, and I loved the fact that we didn't have a BMW yet. We were still on a Aston Martin, so I'm proud that we had our Q, our wonderful Q, Desmond, who for me, he was the original from the beginning. And that was great, and I loved all his little gadgets that he brought to the screen as sort of. So there's a lot of things, I can't remember who M was. I don't even think M appeared in our Bond movie.
Yeah, it was Robert
It would be
Brown.
nice to have had Judi Dench. What?
Robert Brown was M.
Oh, Robert Brown. See, I can't even remember that. I'm ashamed to say. But I haven't seen it in 20 years since, or when I had to, how long it's been. I think I'm proud of the fact that it's not dull, and it's very entertaining, and that it has a charm.
Right, I completely
and
agree.
I have to say, John Barry, John Barry's input in this film for me was great, really great.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the spy game, requires considerable resources, whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair. We're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the Spy Hearts Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors, and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
Yes, Dirty Harry is live, and we are finishing the Star Wars prequels with Revenge of the Sith. Hopefully it's more yes than no.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true spy hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhard. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx.
Now, I appreciate your time is short. I did just want to touch on the Bond Girls Are Forever documentary because I recently revisited it, actually. And I actually watched an updated version than the one I saw originally years ago. Now, the whole phrase Bond Girl seems to be somewhat taboo in ways at the moment, it feels like. It seems like we're moving away from that. And then you were you were quite hold fast in the documentary that you think it's something to be proud of, and I agree with that personally. What is your take on the Bond girl phenomenon now, and maybe looking forward?
Well, it's quite funny because you remember when I interviewed Judi Dench, who was absolutely brilliant in the interview. I interviewed her twice. And I said, would you like to be called a Bond girl or a Bond woman? She said, oh, no, a Bond girl, And so I thought that sort of, for me, encaptured the spirit, because there she was playing a heavyweight character, James Bond's boss, and she wanted to be considered a Bond girl, not a Bond woman. So she encompasses the spirit of how I sort of relate to us having been, Bond girls, and we're part of the club. I think the Bond women came along with Halle Berry, and I think maybe it's more literal, in America, Bond women, because they've got more weight, more gravitas, and they're not just bimbos around the pool in their bikinis. So I think they was trying to get away from that, and that was the evolution. And I respect that completely, totally. And that's fine. But for me, Bond girl brings in the humor and the spirit of how Bond started. I totally agree that at one point, the roles, especially with Maud Adams, when she's with Christopher Lee and he hits her with the golden gun, and then Roger Moore slaps her, in Octopussy. And Maud Adams does talk about the 70s period where, women were more victimized. And I do get her point very strongly. I understand that. And so I think there was a reaction against that, which happened in the 90s, the late 80s and 90s, where women were more feisty and could fight for themselves, and hold their own ground. So that's how Bond women came, the title of Bond women. Yeah.
Right. Now, we always like, when we close off our interviews, we want to thank you so much for your time today. We always like to always ask, the person we're interviewing, what one of their favorite spy movies is. We are a spy movie podcast. We're talking about Bond, but is there any spy movies that jump to mind that were influential for you, or ones you really hold dear?
Oh, well, The Third Man.
Right.
I mean, it's just not a spy movie, but it is about the Cold War, and it is about Vienna being cut into pieces, and about all this, illegal stuff going on. It has that sort of aspect. The Man Who Came from the Cold, with Richard Burton. It's a fantastic film, from John le Carré's book. And I grew up obviously in the Cold War because I was born in 1960. So I used to love watching spy movies. But that's what initially comes to my mind. The Third Man will always remain for me a great classic. And The Man Who Came from the Cold was such an interesting film because it was to show how spies suddenly are just replaceable, and it's such a lonely world being a spy in those days. So it was a very strong film for me when Richard Burton did it, and the book. But I can't think off of my hand of other, great spy classics. But obviously John le Carré wrote quite a few of them.
Those are both fantastic picks, and I think ones that listeners to our show are big fans of as well.
Yeah. And, what was interesting about The Third Man, which is not a spy movie, but it is about the corruption in Vienna, and it is about an investigator friend who's investigating about his friend Harry Lime, played by Joseph Cotton, who's investigating on Orson Welles what's happened to him, So there is that spy Cold War element, and the music is fantastic in that film. But it was written, the screenplay was written by Graham Greene. And I grew up on reading Graham Greene's novels, and he covered that also, so it would always remain in my computer.
I think we recently spoke about, Ministry of Fear was a Graham Greene. Yeah. Well, you are maybe the best person to ask, but we also talk about Bond films from time to time. Now, you obviously acted against Timothy Dalton, but who is your Bond that you would go to if you were ever going to watch a Bond?
If I was going to go and watch a Bond movie now?
Yeah, and
It's
what
not,
actor would you go
it's
for?
not so much about who is my Bond, but which
Mhm.
is the best movie
Okay,
for me,
sure.
best storytelling for me. Because I think every Bond brought in their own quality. And some of their films were better than others. I mean, Sean Connery, of course, was the macho, visceral Bond,
Mhm.
which Ian Fleming had never written him like that. So he was not very keen on having Sean Connery to begin with. I think he wanted Roger Moore. And then totally responded to Cubby Broccoli's choice. And so Sean Connery, Dr. No or Thunderball, these are sort of classics. I think those two I really enjoyed very much. I loved the one with Michelle Yeoh. Is it Tomorrow Never Dies?
Mhm.
I'm blanking now. And then I love the one with Pierce Brosnan and Judi Dench, where she calls him a dinosaur renegade of the 80s. Which one was that?
Goldeneye.
I remember the titles. Goldeneye, I like very much. And then I think Daniel is a very strong contemporary Bond. And I think after 9/11, it was very much Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson who was supporting the idea of bringing an unknown.
Mhm.
Well, and he was not a star at the time. He was a known working actor in England and a very good one.
Mhm.
And they really fought for him with the studios, and they won. And I understood, where they were coming from. And there's a lot to do with Barbara Broccoli, because after 9/11, one whole's perception had changed, and you could not have, tongue-in-cheek, lightweight stuff. So they had to bring much more edge to the character, to the storytelling, and Bond had to be much more of a killer, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But for His Majesty's Secret Service, always, but much more of an edgy, realistic, grounded part. And I think Daniel Craig obviously has done so well. The response to most of the Bond movies that he did were huge success. I think the only one that was not a success was Quantum Solace, but then it wasn't a very good movie.
Mhm.
So you always go by if an actor, first of all is well cast, and Daniel Craig was very well cast in playing Bond, and he delivered beautifully. But when he was in a really strong movie like Casino Royale, it was fantastic.
Well, we're wrapping up now, but I do just want to ask: is there any plans for you to update the Bond Girls Are Forever documentary? Now we've had, Bond's first kid and things like that.
You mean if there's going to be any new girls updated in the documentary?
Absolutely.
No, I don't. No. We did update it.
Mhm.
We updated it after the original film documentary when it premiered at the Hamptons Film Festival and on AMC Cable Network. And then we updated it with a couple of the Bond girls from the following films. And then it's kind of, it loses its we would have to have the finance to re-edit the whole thing and update the whole documentary, because
Mhm.
it was made at a certain time for a certain television broadcaster, and I would completely change it now and make it more edgy. But then I'd need the money to be able to completely look at it again and update it in a different way, and not just keep adding stuff.
Mhm.
So because documentaries now, it would be a much edgier documentary, I think, and with more realism. And of course, the actresses are very important in the film, because they're really telling their experience, and through their experience, you're experiencing what it was like in that time to play a Bond girl and how the parts had evolved. And that was the key to my documentaries, celebrating the women, and some who could not have a career after, or some who didn't have a career because they didn't want to, because they were acting in Bond but not in another. Also, you have to see that the whole period until Carrie Lowell, who was with Timothy in the second Bond, we were all unknown.
Mhm.
and then they cast stars to play the Bond woman. The Bond woman. Nicely. Do you know what I mean? They were not unknown actresses.
Yeah.
So it completely is now taken a new spin. So it's different, and of course I would redo it with pleasure. I have so much pleasure spending time with the actresses, finding out what their experience was, and I would redo it completely and make it more real, more contemporary in a way, because I had to fit in a slot of 52 minutes, you know, for AMC. And so it was done in a certain rhythm with all these commercial breaks that we had to figure out. So now I would like to do a proper film, documentary film, a feature documentary film on the Bond girls. You know, that would be great. And you go more in depth, you know, with how the roles evolved in the scripts, what, you know, it would be really great actually to do that. But it would have to do the whole thing, and I'd need money. You know, I'd need a budget of $500,000 to do it.
Well, you know, now Amazon owns all of this. Maybe there's a chance, and I couldn't think of a better person to lead it than you.
You're so nice to say that. Yeah, maybe they need maybe we got to see what's going to be the next Bond movie, and then maybe it might be interesting.
Yeah,
so then, yeah.
I want to thank you, Maryam, for taking the time to speak to us. Before you leave us, is there anything you're working on at the moment you want to talk about, or any causes you're passionate about you want to just shout out on the show?
So, and films, you know, they come and go. I don't know. So we'll see. And I'm also putting together a documentary, because I've produced a couple of documentaries since Bond Girls Are Forever. One on female war reporters, again on women. Then one on surviving brain hemorrhages, because I had a brain hemorrhage in 2007. So it's about the survivors' stories. And now I'm putting a documentary together. It's going to take a few years, about the Georgian migration, because I'm half Georgian. And it's about this first migration in 1920s. But it is also a universal topic, because it's about migration and the problems today and all of that. So but that's a long project. So there we are. And if I play James Bond's grandmother next time, I'll let you know.
Well, Maryam, unless you have anything left to declare, we want to thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you
it's
so
been a
much
real
for
pleasure.
having me. Okay, take care. Bye.
Take care. All the best.
Bye.
And there you go. That was our chat with Maryam Dabo. Again, I want to thank her for taking the time to speak to us today. It was a cold and dreary day in London, but she certainly brightened our skies.
Definitely. And I rewatched The Living Daylights the night before we did this interview, and it was really interesting to hear her talk about the evolution of the Bond girl character, because Kara really does feel very different when you measure her against a lot of the women who appeared in the Moore era. I look at maybe one of the ones that I was writing notes comparing her to in some ways was Carol Bouquet in For Your Eyes Only. It felt like one who was very much with him throughout for the action, which wasn't the case for a lot of them. I think Maud Adams is great in Octopussy, but she's often removed because of just her place in the story, whereas Kara feels so central to everything that's going on. And I don't know that was a particularly common thing going on with those Roger Moore films.
And, you know, I think she didn't give herself enough credit, and I pointed it out in the interview. I think the change to Dalton made a shift, a seismic shift in the Bond world. And I think having a more serious Bond allowed them to have more serious Bond girls. And I'm using that phrase because she approves of it. Bond girls. And her character, I mean, we were given a bunch of questions by our listeners on Twitter, and I'm sorry we didn't get time to talk about those questions because they were great questions. But, you know, one of them said, I think it was John, said, you know, she is the first Bond woman to really be with him throughout the film and not really have any other particular love interest. You could say the lady in Gibraltar at the start, but really, Kara is the main focus in this film.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Like, the movie really does focus on that character a lot, and it's something I didn't really get a chance to talk to her about, but I really appreciate when I watch the film. Her character could be portrayed as, like, so dim. Like, she's very naive. You see she's been misled by Koskov through the movie. You know, she thinks she's in love with Koskov, and that's what basically kicks off the whole story. And it's a character that could easily just be portrayed as just hopelessly naive, like a character you're rolling your eyes at. but there's like an actual strength and an agency to that character that emerges throughout the course of the film. Like it feels like they're evolving her throughout the course of the movie, which is not super common. It did happen. It's not like this was the first time, but it does feel different in the way they handle it than the past.
And also, you talk about the Living Daylights, and a lot of people say, GoldenEye was the first post-Cold War Bond film, and it technically was, more or less. But, this is, in my earliest memory, the one to deal with the Cold War more. Like, it was a defecting spy and things like that. I think they were more just the USSR earlier on.
Yeah, and she talked about how they really wanted to take it back to Fleming for this one, which, yeah, like a lot of those Cold War tropes were like so crucial to those stories, and it's there in the early Connerys, but not with the seriousness you get here. Like Living Daylights feels much more of an intense, serious film in a lot of ways, and I just don't think in many ways audiences were ready for it at the time. It's why I think it has so much of a resurgence in more recent years, where a lot of Bond fans look at it with far more shining light. Like they really do hold it up quite high as an example of one that would lead into the Craig era. I do think it's fascinating, though. She talked about how, Pierce Brosnan was originally going to play Bond in this movie. It would have been just interesting to see Pierce Brosnan in a much more serious Cold War spy film, because his era has its own unique feel. His movies don't feel like this.
No, I mean, we'll get around to tackling the Dalton films at some point down the road, and I'm looking forward to going back and really diving into them. But I from what I've read about this film, it was a lot of Timothy Dalton pushing for the more literary Bond, the Fleming Bond. And so I think having Brosnan on the project, and especially coming off of Remington Steele, which is a light comedy, I think he would have had a bit more yucking it up, to be honest with you. I think this film would be slightly more comedic. And this is not License to Kill. This is not a somewhat dour film. This is full of comedic bits. So I actually think he would have had more comedy in it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember interviews with Dalton where they said he read all the books and everything and really came in prepared to tackle the literary roots of Ian Fleming. I don't know that many past Bond actors had done that. I don't know that George Lazenby was going in being like, I've read all the books, and guys, I have some ideas.
Kilts are my idea.
Yeah,
but we're digressing off of the lady of the hour, Maryam, of course, and not only obviously we've mentioned that Kara was such a strong character in the film. Also, you have to think Maryam had a lasting impression on the Bond franchise in a way, not only with the documentary, but I think you look at Natalia, for instance, in GoldenEye. A lot of Natalia you can see in Kara.
definitely. And also the way that they deal more seriously with the romance in this movie, that was obviously to do with the AIDS crisis at the time. They wanted a more monogamous Bond. But you see how the relationship he has with Kara on screen feeds into how they handle relationships going forward. Like, I think, we talked about how much we loved Bond and Natalia together in GoldenEye. But I think it's like the relationship with Bond and Kara here that gives them the confidence to tell these types of stories and to continue to evolve them until we get to the Craig era. You've got characters like Vesper and Madeline Swan in those relationships. So Kara to me feels like in some ways leading into that sort of, handling of those relationships.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. On our Patreon exclusive, patreon.com/spyhards, we have a film commentary for GoldenEye. And we spent a lot of time talking about our love for the Natalia character. But just going back and revisiting The Living Daylights for this interview, I was struck just by some of the similarities. So I maybe should have tipped my hat more in that film commentary just about the sort of the beeline from one to the other.
Definitely you should have, Scott.
Yeah,
I'm embarrassed you didn't.
It's all on me. But the other thing as well to say about Maryam is, you've got people talk a lot about this serious Timothy Dalton Bond and Shakespearean actor. It's there. It's clearly that is him. But they needed to find an actor to play against him, and to have a chemistry with him, and that's a tough find. And I think they nailed it with Maryam. I think she came in strong. She knew what she wanted, and she knew who the character was. And that allowed her to relax into creating this, because she said in the interview, it was a very relaxed set. They had some great moments. She's told some great stories about, the film premiere and riding around the deserts with Dalton and Art Malik as well. Lovely memories of the set. There was no tension by the sounds of it. It was a very nurturing set. Allowed them to really explore the characters and find what they wanted. And it's a tall order to find someone to stand up against Timothy Dalton, and it's rare that you find someone so good out the gate.
And their chemistry is really strong in the movie. And this was Dalton's first Bond film. That's a lot of pressure on him, a lot of moving parts going on all around him. It could have been overwhelming to the point where he would be in a zone of like, I just got to focus on my performance. I just have to be able to land this okay. Versus like really collaborating with her to get this sort of romance across. But they really have genuine chemistry. And it's something that, I mean, I don't know, like how many, scenes of genuine chemistry did Roger Moore have with the various Bond girls in his era? Not that many, really. Not like this. Like there's a tenderness to this relationship that I think really works. And I think a lot of that comes from just the way that Maryam projects like the vulnerability of that character. So it was really interesting just to hear her talk about finding that sort of, that sort of central romance amidst a gigantic production happening all around them.
Now, what listeners don't know is you do a lot of research for these interviews, and so do I. But you also watched her first ever film, and we didn't get a chance to talk to her about it. So maybe just share your thoughts on Extra.
Yeah, Extra is a 1982 sci-fi horror film that she appeared in, and I will say narratively, pretty messy. It kind of goes all over the place, but in terms of like 80s prosthetic effects and body horror and kind of a very dark riff on the E.T. kind of concept where you have sort of this extraterrestrial invasion happening towards a family in crisis. It really examines that in like a horror movie way. So it's a very interesting movie. I think it's aged, questionably in a lot of ways, but in terms of like gooey practical effects and atmosphere, it still does hold up pretty well.
And what is Maryam's role in the film?
She plays basically the maid, I guess, or she lives with the central character and her son and helps look after the son. I don't know what the exact role would be. Maybe a bit of a nanny.
Sure. Okay. No dinosaurs though.
No, and she is turned into a incubator for some sort of alien eggs at a certain point in the movie.
Well, that's a turn.
It is a turn indeed. Kara did not go down that road, thankfully.
No, thankfully. And, of course, Maryam helped create the Bond Girls Are Forever documentary that's had 2 versions out there now where she sort of charts the course of the Bond girl phenomenon and speaks to a lot of the actors involved, all the way back from Ursula Andress, she's spoken to, all the way up to Halle Berry, Judi Dench, Sophia Marceau. She's spoken to a lot of the seminal Bond girls. It's a really fascinating documentary, and I was glad to get a chance to speak to her about it. We were very short on time, so I would like to have dived into it a bit more. But she's very open to doing an update, and I think the update is due actually.
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching this documentary back in 2002. I've seen it a couple times, and I would like to see it evolve into something else in the future. She talked about how, unless they got money, probably unlikely. But it does feel like a fun work in progress to continue to examine with each new era, because I think the perception of what a Bond girl is changes pretty drastically with every passing era of an actor.
Yeah, I mean, we've just gone through the era where Bond's had a kid and been blown up.
Yeah.
And there's a female 007. I mean, this is way past the release of No Time to Die, so we can say that out loud now. That feels nice. But, well, we did briefly speak to her about the whole Bond girl and her thoughts on it, because, some people now are kind of against the phrase, and they find Bond girl to be a bit dismissive and derogatory towards women. But it's nice to know that the people that actually played the characters don't have the same feelings.
Yeah, I mean, Judi Dench. Stamp of approval right there, I guess.
What more do you need?
Right.
And then finally, we spoke to her about her favorite spy films, and she actually went off of the beaten track. She went down Le Carré. She mentioned The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and The Third Man, which we would count as a spy film.
Mm-hmm. We will be tackling that in the future. I am looking forward to doing The Third Man, and of course, it's notable that
The Living Daylights features an homage to The Third Man. So, yeah,
It all just comes round in one neat and tidy circle.
definitely.
That's better. Cam, what do we have next week?
Yes, we are tackling the 1981 Donald Sutherland thriller, Eye of the Needle.
Yeah, this is not one I've seen before, but to start this new 100, we just celebrated our first 100, but to start this next chapter on Spy Hard's podcast, we thought, hey, let's do what we do best. Go a little bit obscure and try and find an interesting film that may have been forgotten about. I'm looking forward to checking out this film, and I hope you all are too. Your mission, then, should you choose to accept it, is to watch Eye of the Needle from 1981 and join us next week. If you enjoyed what you heard on this podcast, if you love hearing interviews with Bond stars and directors, screenwriters, anything like that, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts, or just tell your friends. And don't forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, Cam, do you have anything to declare?